Welcome, dear listeners, to Whispers in the Dark, where shadows tell stories and the night breathes secrets. I'm your guide through the unknown, your storyteller in the silence, weaving tales that will haunt your thoughts long after the last word fades. Here we embrace the eerie, the unsettling, the stories that lurk just beyond the edge of the firelight. So settle in, dim the lights, and listen closely. The darkness has something to say. The first spine-chilling tale of Series 2 from Whispers in the Dark podcast is now here, and it's one that will haunt you long after the final whisper fades. So let's begin this special tale, the Flight of Squadron 13. The air inside the radar control room was thick, with heat, with boredom, and with the unmistakable scent of rusting metal. Sergeant David Kelton sat hunched over his screen, the green glow casting ghostly shadows across his face. It was 0200 hours, the hour when the world feels most dead, and RAF Forward Operating Base Ainsley was nothing more than a concrete coffin lost among the moors of North Yorkshire. Kelton hated nights like this. Too quiet. The silence pressed against the inside of his skull like a vice. He took another drag of his cigarette, watching the smoke curl upward and disappear into the humming darkness. "Anything," came the voice of Corporal Jenny Marsh through the comms. "Not a thing," Kelton muttered. "Just ghosts and sheep." Static answered him, followed by a laugh. He leaned back in the squeaky swivel chair and yawned. 42 years old, 15 of those in uniform, most spent monitoring the skies for things that never came. The Cold War had ended before his career began. The only dogfights he witnessed were in simulations. His job now was to track training flights, whisper coordinates into the ears of pilots a decade younger than him, and wait for the enemy that never arrived. That was until 2:17. The radar blipped, a sudden spike center right of the display. Kelton leaned forward, eyes narrowing. A contact had entered restricted airspace at 1,500 feet, moving slow. Very slow. Not a drone, too big. Not a training craft. No scheduled sorties. He keyed the microphone. "Unidentified aircraft entering Zone Echo 3. This is Ainsley Control. You are in a restricted flight corridor. Identify yourself." The blip kept moving, crawling south, its IFF tag blank. He adjusted the frequency. "Repeat, unknown aircraft. This is Ainsley Control. State your call sign then." The tag flickered. SPT-13. Kelton's heart skipped a beat. That tag wasn't even in the system. He tapped the console. "Jenny, you picking this up?" "What?" "No, nothing here." Kelton swallowed. The tag stayed on screen for 10 more seconds, and then vanished. But before it did, something else came. Static flared through his headset, sharp and biting, and beneath it, a voice. Broken, warbled, male, British. "Ainsley, this is a lieutenant. Down, fire, oh God, they're burning." The voice disintegrated into a scream. Kelton tore the headset off, breathing hard. He stared at the console, which now displayed a perfect sweep. Empty. And then, the unmistakable roar of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine overhead. He stood, ran to the window, his breath caught in his throat. There, glinting silver in the moonlight, a single-seat Spitfire hurtled low over the runway. He saw it, heard it, felt the windows rattle in their frames, but the landing strip was empty. Not a light, not a shadow. No tire marks. Nothing. He didn't sleep that day. Marsh thought he'd lost it. "You're running on fumes, Dave," she said. "Radar ghosts happen." It was probably a fluke, but he knew better. He knew the difference between electrical interference and a full-body hallucination that stank of aviation fuel and blood. That night, he came back to the radar room armed with coffee, his old flight manuals, and a growing sense of dread. He pulled out the flight logs from the previous 20 years. Nothing about a Spitfire being used for commemorative flights. Nothing in the museum's schedule. Nothing in the Warbird registry. But the designation SPT-13 burned in his mind. He typed it into the terminal. Classified, restricted clearance. His military login wouldn't let him in. But a backdoor entry, the kind only veterans who'd been around long enough to know where the paper clips were buried could find, gave him access to a single entry. Squadron 13, Operational Summary, redacted. Date, 15th March, 1944. Aircraft, Spitfire Mark 9X7. Mission, Operation Clean Wing. Recon over Heligoland. Byte status, 6 KIA. 1 RTB, crashed on landing. Kelton stared at the file. 7 planes. 1 returned. And that one crashed on final approach, here, at Ainsley Field. His fingers trembled as he scrolled further, but the rest of the file was blacked out. And that's when he heard it again. The scream, from the hallway outside. Human, ragged, choked by fire. Kelton stood, heart racing, and opened the radar room door. The hallway was dark, cold. At the far end, just beneath the emergency light, stood a man, helmet clutched in one hand. His other hand hung at a grotesque angle, bones poking through torn skin. His face, half burned, with one eye white and blind.
"You left us. You left us. You left us,"
the ghost said. The lights blew out. The storm rolled in just after midnight, a slow-moving wall of black clouds crawling over the moors like a living thing. RAF Ainsley, already isolated by fields of mud and rusting wire fences, seemed to shrink under its weight. Wind scraped the hangars and control tower like fingernails across sheet metal. It was the kind of night when the sky didn't just weep, it seethed. David Kelton sat alone in his bunk, the overhead light flickering with the dying pulse of old wiring. The folder lay open on the table before him, the words etched into the yellowed page like the last breath of a dying man. Operation Clean Wing, reconnaissance over Heligoland Bight. Status, 6 killed in action. 1 returned to base, crashed on landing. RTB pilot, Flight Lieutenant Alaric Vale. He had read the report a dozen times, each pass more suffocating than the last. There was a hollowness to it, too neat, too clinical. The language was sanitized, as if war could be reduced to numbers and acronyms. But it was the last line that made his stomach churn. Recovery status, no remains retrieved. Cause of failure, classified. Debrief cancelled due to pilot's death upon impact. He knew what he had seen. The ghost of Vale, his scorched skin peeling like old paint, eyes gleaming with some terrible knowing. And the others, Kelton had only glimpsed their silhouettes, felt their presence press against the edges of the radar room like a shifting weight. This was no sleep-deprived hallucination. Something had come back, and it wanted to be seen. The base archives lay deep beneath the northern wing, where even the mold didn't bother to grow. The concrete staircase smelled of piss and kerosene, a reminder of decades' worth of secrets buried beneath bureaucracy and dust. The door to the records room groaned open like a mouth reluctant to speak. Inside, metal shelves stood in tight rows, reaching into shadow. Fluorescent tubes overhead sputtered in fits of dying light, barely illuminating the stacks. Kelton moved through the aisles with his torch in hand, brushing aside cobwebs that clung to his face like gauze. In a back cabinet marked SPT, WWII, he found them. 7 folders, each labeled with a pilot's name and serial number, each stamped with a red X. He flipped through the reports one by one. Flight Sergeant Douglas Hale, Pilot Officer Ronan Page, Warrant Officer Thomas Braze, Lieutenant Vale. The reports were nearly identical. Presumed KIA, no bodies recovered, aircraft lost over the North Sea. Every entry was little more than a death certificate written in passive voice. But Vale's was different. Nestled between fuel manifests and airframe inspection notes was a single page, torn, handwritten in pencil. The lines were crooked, slashed in a frantic hand. We weren't meant to come back. They burned before they screamed. They locked us in the sky and threw away the key. The paper smelled of ash. Kelton's stomach twisted. He glanced toward the door. It was closed, but the air had changed, thicker, like water. A faint sound stirred, metallic, rhythmic, the unmistakable echo of bootsteps. Slow, heavy, growing louder. Kelton turned off the torch. The steps continued. And then silence. The air turned cold. So cold his breath bloomed before him like fog on a winter pond. Somewhere in the dark something moved. Not with sound, but with presence. A sensation that slid across his skin like frostbite. He turned, heart thudding. A figure stood in the far aisle, barely illuminated by the flickering lights. RAF flight uniform. Helmet under one arm, charred flesh clinging to bone. One eye hung in a blistered socket. The other burned with something deeper than rage. It stared, and then it was gone. Just gone. Like a switch had been flipped. But the cold lingered. Kelton stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of boxes. The papers scattered like dry leaves, fluttering to the ground in silence. Outside, the storm had thickened. Sheets of rain hammered the tarmac, as if the skies were trying to drown the base. Kelton walked the length of the empty hangars, soaked to the bone, staring up into the flashing sky. A sudden flicker of lightning illuminated the runway. There, in the distance, faint but distinct, a shape shimmered in the downpour. A Spitfire, nose pointed north, canopy open, silver frame gleaming like it had been polished that morning. Kelton froze. Another flash, and it was gone. Not a trace. No puddles disturbed, no tire marks, only the scent of oil and burnt ozone clinging to the air. Sleep never came. The next morning, the world was grey and unreal. The rain had stopped, but the sky hung low, pressing against the earth like a lid on a coffin. Kelton spent hours poring through online aviation logs and old microfilm reels in the base's dusty historical centre. He needed to know who approved Operation Clean Wing, who gave the order. It took hours, but eventually he found it. A single name appeared across multiple documents: orders, requisitions, test logs. General Ormond Rourke, decorated war hero, strategist, deceased 1963, buried with honours. And yet, there was something buried deeper. A series of research memos from a lab called Cambridge Materials Division, wartime contractors specialising in fuel additives. MX-12, the memo read, unstable under high pressure, Accelerated combustion under altitude shift. Not approved for combat deployment. Someone had ignored that warning, and 7 men had burned for it. That night, the base changed. Kelton felt it the moment he stepped outside for a smoke. The wind carried whispers, indistinct, broken, like intercepted radio chatter from a dying plane. The sky above the base flickered, not lightning, flame. He ran toward the old hangar, the same hangar where the vision had begun. As he approached, the tarmac cracked beneath his feet, hairline fractures spreading outward like veins. The air smelled of scorched leather and wet copper. The hangar doors stood wide open, groaning on rusted hinges. Inside, the world had reverted. Gone was the empty ruin. In its place, a fully restored war-era bay, bustling with ghostly life. Mechanics moved like shadows, translucent men carrying spectral tools. Pilots in flight suits sat atop their Spitfires, chatting, laughing. Cigarette smoke curled from mouths long turned to dust. Kelton walked among them. None noticed him. Then came the countdown. A voice echoed from the loudspeaker, distorted and cold.
Operation Clean Wing. T-minus 5 minutes.
The pilots mounted up. One by one, the Spitfires roared to life. Except something was wrong. The sound wasn't pure. It carried distortion, like screams buried in static. Kelton clutched his ears as the first engine ignited, the sound sharp and inhuman. Flames burst from the exhaust. The pilot inside thrashed, mouth open in a silent scream. His body began to blacken. The second plane burst into fire before its wheels left the ground. The third flipped, its wings torn from its body mid-roll. Blood and fire erupted from the cockpit. All around him, the hangar became a charnel house. Ghosts shrieked as their planes detonated. Metal screamed and warped. Flesh blistered. Eyes melted. The stench of cooked organs filled the air. The sixth plane rose into the sky before it disintegrated, raining glowing ash. Only one remained. Kelton awoke in the infirmary. His skin was cold to the touch. His heart was slow. Marsh stood over him, pale and shaken. She said she'd found him on the runway, unconscious, muttering names in a voice that wasn't his. Names she later learned belonged to Squadron 13. The days that followed blurred. The base itself began to show signs of decay. Paint peeled in long strips from the control tower. The walls sweated rust. Alarms went off without cause. Computers rebooted into black screens showing strings of pilot serial numbers that couldn't be cleared. Kelton stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. The squadron of the damned, soaring through a sky of flame. Their bodies trapped in eternal descent, clawing at their cockpits, burned tongues trying to scream. And always, Vale's voice behind it all. Not angry, not even vengeful, just patient, waiting. Late one night, Kelton stood in the observation tower. Below, the runway stretched into darkness. He gripped the pilot logbook Vale had given him in the vision, now fully material, burned but intact. Thunder rumbled across the sky. And then, the sound again. That engine. That goddamn engine. Low and smooth, the Merlin purred across the night like a panther in heat. Out of the clouds came the planes, 6 of them, flying low and silent, their fuselages glowing with an inner light, wings leaving trails of ash and vapor. The air traffic control systems exploded into life, screens flashing red, radar arrays screaming. The base lights flickered. From the sky, the dead were returning. And Kelton knew this was only the beginning. The night settled like a shroud over RAF Ainsley. Silence wrapped the base in a suffocating blanket, thick and heavy, broken only by the occasional scrape of wind against rusted metal and the distant bark of a stray dog. But the quiet was wrong. It pressed in too tightly, like the calm before a storm so fierce it would tear the sky open. David Kelton sat in the radar room, eyes glued to the dim glow of the monitor, which flickered with erratic blips. The cold gnawed at his bones, and every breath came out in little clouds, frost blooming in the stale air. He hadn't slept in days. Sleep was a betrayal, inviting the night's horrors to crawl into his mind and tear it apart. The ghostly engine hum returned, low and constant beneath the white noise of the machines. It was a sound that no one else could hear, except Kelton. And it wasn't alone. From the corner of his vision, shadows moved, flickering and stretching like smoke, twisting in a slow, malevolent dance. The room's edges darkened and contracted, the walls seeming to breathe inward. Without warning, the radar screen went black. A chill seized him, as if the air itself had turned to ice. The monitor sputtered back to life, but the blips were no longer random dots. They aligned, 7 blips moving in formation, perfectly spaced, like a squadron on the hunt. Kelton's throat tightened. His hands shook as he reached for the microphone. No static, no voice, only silence, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, a new sound shattered the silence. The roar of engines, far too close and impossibly loud for the empty tarmac outside. The entire base trembled. Kelton forced himself up, stumbling into the corridor where the fluorescent lights flickered wildly. The sound grew, a bone-rattling rumble that seemed to come from all directions at once, like an airborne freight train bearing down on him. He burst through the hangar doors. The night sky was ablaze. 7 Spitfires tore across the moonlight, engines screaming with unnatural fury. Their metallic skins shimmered and cracked, fissures glowing with fiery veins beneath. The planes bore scorch marks, twisted insignias of blackened wings and skulls. They weren't just machines. They were burning corpses, flying funeral pyres with shattered glass cockpits that flickered with flickering shadows of the pilots inside. Suddenly, the air rippled. The spectral forms of the squadron emerged from the shadows, their charred bodies hovering inches from the ground, smoke trailing from their broken limbs like funeral pyres. Their eyes locked on Kelton, burning coals of hatred and sorrow. One by one, they moved toward him, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes pulled by the strings of rage. Kelton's throat closed with fear. He turned to flee, but the hangar door slammed shut with a deafening crash. He was trapped. The temperature plummeted. Ice crystallized on his skin as the pilots advanced. Their voices, once screams, now a chilling chorus of accusation, whispering,
"Remember us. Remember the betrayal."
A spectral hand brushed his cheek, a touch like fire and ash, leaving a burning mark that smoldered beneath his skin. The pain exploded, and the ghost surged forward. Suddenly, Kelton was no longer in the hangar. He was in the cockpit of a Spitfire. Flames licked the edges of the canopy. Smoke filled his lungs. The plane shuddered violently as alarms screamed in his ears. He looked down. The fuselage was torn open. Raw metal twisted and bleeding black ichor. Voices filled his head, radio chatter, frantic and broken.
"Engine failure! Engine failure! It's burning!
The world tilted and spun. The sky bled red and orange. Below, the cold sea waited, He screamed. Then the plane slammed into the waves. Water ripped through the cockpit. Cold fire engulfed him. He gasped awake on the hangar floor, sweat soaking his clothes, heart pounding like a war drum. But the nightmare didn't end. From every corner of the base, radios began to crackle to life. Ghostly static, broken Morse code, spectral voices whispering secrets of betrayal and death. Air traffic control systems failed. Screens flickered with images of burning planes and twisted faces. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the sky, always the sky, began to bleed fire. Days passed, but the haunting deepened. Kelton's reflection in windows twisted, face melting into the visage of Vale's burned pilot. At night, the shadows moved with intent. Figures stalked the edges of his vision, twisted pilots with scorched wings, faces torn and molten, reaching out with grasping hands. The base itself rotted from within. Steel groaned as if in agony. Rust spread like a cancer. Concrete cracked, whispering the screams of the damned beneath. One night, Kelton awoke to the sound of wheels scraping the runway. He dressed and ran outside. The night was alive with fire. The ghost Spitfires lined up on the tarmac. They sat silent, engines idling, smoke coiling from shattered exhausts. Kelton approached the closest plane. The cockpit canopy lifted with a screech. Inside, Vale's face stared back, half melted, eyes burning with eternal fury. Without warning, the canopy slammed shut. Kelton screamed as flames erupted, scorching his skin without burning. The smell of charred flesh filled his nostrils. He fell to his knees, clutching his face, unable to scream over the roar of the engines rising in crescendo. The planes took off. Their shadows tore across the night sky, casting long, burning silhouettes against the clouds. And as they disappeared into the storm, Kelton knew the dead had come to claim their revenge, and the living would pay. Night at RAF Ainsley felt less like the absence of light, and more like an oppressive weight settling on the base. It crept slowly through the corridors and rooms, an unseen presence pressing into the skin and bone of everything it touched. David Kelton sat slumped in the radar room, his eyes hollow and bloodshot, staring at the flickering screen. The chill in the air had nothing to do with the failing heating system. His breath came out in white puffs, the cold seeping into his very marrow, and yet the sweat on his palms betrayed the anxiety clawing at his chest. Something was wrong. It started with a low hum, faint at first, barely more than a vibration in the air. The hum grew deeper and steadier until it filled the room with a dreadful resonance, vibrating in Kelton's skull and setting his nerves on edge. It was the unmistakable growl of Merlin engines, those powerful warbirds, yet no plane flew above the base. The radar confirmed it. No aircraft were in the vicinity. Then came the shadows. They flickered and stretched across the walls of the control room, twisting like living smoke. The edges of the monitors blackened as if darkness itself bled from the corners, swallowing the room in a growing void. The cold shifted from physical to something far worse, a presence. Kelton's gaze darted around. The hairs on his neck stood erect, and his skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes watching, waiting. Suddenly, the radar screen went black. A chill seized him, as if the air itself had turned to ice. The monitor sputtered back to life, but the blips were no longer random dots. They aligned, 7 blips moving in formation, perfectly spaced, like a squadron on the hunt. Kelton's throat tightened. His hand shook as he reached for the microphone. No static, no voice, only silence thick and suffocating. Suddenly, a new sound shattered the silence. The roar of engines, far too close and impossibly loud for the empty tarmac outside. Outside, the entire base trembled. Kelton forced himself up, stumbling into the corridor where the fluorescent lights flickered wildly. The sound grew, a bone-rattling rumble that seemed to come from all directions at once, like an airborne freight train bearing down on him. He burst through the hangar doors. The night sky was ablaze. 7 Spitfires tore across the moonlight, engines screaming with unnatural fury. Their metallic skins shimmered and cracked, fissures glowing with fiery veins beneath. The planes bore scorch marks, twisted insignias of blackened wings and skulls. They weren't just machines. They were burning corpses, flying funeral pyres with shattered glass cockpits that flickered with flickering shadows of the pilots inside. Suddenly, the air rippled. The spectral forms of the squadron emerged from the shadows, their charred bodies hovering inches from the ground, smoke trailing from their broken limbs like funeral pyres. Their eyes locked on Kelton, burning coals of hatred and sorrow. One by one, they moved toward him, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes pulled by the strings of rage. Kelton's throat closed with fear. He turned to flee, but the hangar door slammed shut with a deafening crash. He was trapped. The temperature plummeted. Ice crystallized on his skin as the pilots advanced. Their voices, once screams, now a chilling chorus of accusation, whispering,
Remember us!
A spectral hand brushed his cheek, a touch like fire and ash, leaving a burning mark that smoldered beneath his skin. The pain exploded, and the ghost surged forward. Suddenly, Kelton was no longer in the hangar. He was in the cockpit of a Spitfire. Flames licked the edges of the canopy. Smoke filled his lungs. The plane shuddered violently as alarm screamed in his ears. He looked down. The fuselage was torn open, raw metal twisted and bleeding black ichor. Voices filled his head, radio chatter, frantic and broken. Engine failure, flames in the cockpit, controls dead. The world tilted and spun. The sky bled red and orange. Below, the cold sea waited. He screamed. Then the plane slammed into the waves. Water ripped through the cockpit. Cold fire engulfed him. He gasped awake on the hangar floor, sweat soaking his clothes, heart pounding like a war drum. But the nightmare didn't end. From every corner of the base, radios began to crackle to life. Ghostly static, broken Morse code, spectral voices whispering secrets of betrayal and death. Air traffic control systems failed. Screens flickered with images of burning planes and twisted faces. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the sky, always the sky, began to bleed fire. Days passed, but the haunting deepened. Kelton's reflection in windows twisted, face melting into the visage of Vale's burned pilot. At night, the shadows moved with intent. Figures stalked the edges of his vision, twisted pilots with scorched wings, faces torn and molten, reaching out with grasping hands. The base itself rotted from within. Steel groaned as if in agony. Rust spread like a cancer. Concrete cracked, whispering the screams of the dam beneath. One night, Kelton awoke to the sound of wheels scraping the runway. He dressed and ran outside. The night was alive with fire. The ghost Spitfires lined up on the tarmac. They sat silent, engines idling, smoke coiling from shattered exhausts. Kelton approached the closest plane. The cockpit canopy lifted with a screech. Inside, Vale's face stared back, half melted, eyes burning with eternal fury. Without warning, the canopy slammed shut. Kelton screamed as flames erupted, scorching his skin without burning. The smell of charred flesh filled his nostrils. He fell to his knees, clutching his face, unable to scream over the roar of the engines rising in crescendo. The planes took off. Their shadows tore across the night sky, casting long, burning silhouettes against the clouds. And as they disappeared into the storm, Kelton knew the dead had come to claim their revenge, and the living would pay. Night at RAF Ainsley felt less like the absence of light and more like an oppressive weight settling on the base. It crept slowly through the corridors and rooms, an unseen presence pressing into the skin and bone of everything it touched. David Kelton sat slumped in the radar room, his eyes hollow and bloodshot, staring at the flickering screen. The chill in the air had nothing to do with the failing heating system. His breath came out in white puffs, the cold seeping into his very marrow, and yet the sweat on his palms betrayed the anxiety clawing at his chest. Something was wrong. It started with a low hum, faint at first, barely more than a vibration in the air. The hum grew deeper and steadier until it filled the room with a dreadful resonance, vibrating in Kelton's skull and setting his nerves on edge. It was the unmistakable growl of Merlin engines, those powerful warbirds, yet no plane flew above the base. The radar confirmed it. No aircraft were in the vicinity. Then came the shadows. They flickered and stretched across the walls of the control room, twisting like living smoke. The edges of the monitors blackened as if darkness itself bled from the corners, swallowing the room in a growing void. The cold shifted from physical to something far worse, a presence. Kelton's gaze darted around. The hairs on his neck stood erect, and his skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the radar screen went black. The silence was suffocating. Then, blinking back to life, the radar showed not one, but 7 blips in perfect formation. Silent, unyielding, moving steadily toward the base. The eerie alignment was impossible. The radar should have been broken. Yet the blips persisted, edging closer. Kelton reached for the microphone, lips trembling, but when he keyed the channel, only silence answered. The engines roared. Outside, not the distant rumble of a single plane, but the full-throated scream of 7 fighters tearing across the sky. He stumbled into the hallway, heart hammering, and burst through the hangar doors. The stormy night was lit by a supernatural fire. 7 Spitfires streaked across the moonlit tarmac in deadly formation. But these weren't normal planes. Their fuselages shimmered with an unnatural sheen, cracked and blistered like molten glass. Flames licked at the metal surfaces, curling into ethereal smoke that left trails of ash falling like dead leaves. Cockpit canopies glowed with an eerie, sickly green light. Through the shattered glass, Kelton glimpsed the pilots. Horrific, charred faces contorted in eternal agony. Their eyes were not eyes but glowing embers, burning with hatred and sorrow. Mouths opened wide in silent screams that seemed to echo in Kelton's mind. The entire base trembled beneath their passage, cracks spiderwebbing across the tarmac. Kelton's breath caught in his throat as the unholy squadron roared past, their engines screaming a sound beyond description. Not mechanical, but human. A sound filled with pain and rage. He staggered back, clutching his ears as blood throbbed behind his eyes. The hangar lights flickered violently before dying altogether. The darkness rushed in, thick and suffocating. Kelton's flashlight pierced the void, revealing walls smeared with a dark, sticky substance. The concrete was scratched deep, long jagged lines carved by desperate hands, spelling out a single phrase in crude letters. They burned us alive. Suddenly the air shifted. The temperature plunged further until every breath felt like shards of glass cutting through his lungs. From the darkness, figures emerged, ghostly shapes moving. 7 silhouettes, half formed and consumed by shadows. Their bodies twisted and blackened, smoke drifting from broken limbs like funeral pyres. Their faces were melting masks of agony, charred flesh hanging loose, eyes glowing like dying stars. Slowly, they advanced toward Kelton, jerky movements that seemed unnatural, like puppets jerked by invisible strings. Kelton's heart screamed in terror as he tried to flee, but the hangar doors slammed shut with the force of a bomb blast. The temperature dropped even lower, and the cold seeped into his very bones. The spirits closed in, their voices a whispering chorus that rattled the air. Suddenly, Kelton was no longer in the hangar. He found himself strapped into the cockpit of a Spitfire, the air thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Flames licked at the edges of the canopy. The world shook violently. The instruments screamed warnings, lights flashing red. The fuselage was torn open, raw metal twisted like torn flesh, oozing a black, oily substance that smelled like burnt flesh. A frantic voice crackled over the radio, frantic skin. But the nightmare followed him, and fragmented.
Fire in the cockpit! Fire controls are dead!
The sky outside was a roiling hellscape, painted in red and orange. Flames engulfed the wings. The plane bucked violently. Kelton's heart pounded, a wild beat as if it would break free from his chest. The world tilted, spinning out of control. Below, the sea waited, black and merciless. He screamed as the plane slammed into the waves, cold water ripping through the cockpit. Pain exploded in his lungs as the burning fire merged with drowning cold. Then everything went black. Kelton jolted awake, gasping on the hangar floor, drenched in sweat, his clothes clinging to his skin. But the nightmare followed him. Radios around the base erupted into chaotic static. Morse code tapped from the dead. Whispers of betrayal carried across frequencies. Screens in the radar room flickered violently, displaying images of burning planes and distorted pilot faces. The air around the base seemed charged with static electricity, the tension palpable. The haunting did not relent. Every night, Kelton found himself dragged back into that cockpit, reliving the plane's final moments over and over. The faces of the dead stared at him from shadows and reflections, twisted, burnt, forever trapped between life and death. His own reflection fractured and morphed, taking on the visage of Vale, the doomed pilot whose ghost had haunted him from the start. He felt his sanity fray, the line between reality and nightmare dissolving. The base itself began to decay under the weight of the spirit's presence. Metal groaned in torment. Rust spread rapidly, eating through machinery and walls alike. The concrete cracked, fractures like bleeding scars. Every creak and groan whispered the sorrows of the dead, their pain etched into the very bones of the base. One night, Kelton was roused by a scraping noise outside. Drawn by morbid curiosity and dread, he went to the runway. There, lined up like a fleet of phantoms, were the 7 spectral Spitfires. Their engines idled, but the sound was unnatural, hissing and pulsing, a low rumble like breathing. Smoke curled from shattered exhausts, carrying the stench of burning flesh. Kelton approached one plane slowly, dread tightening around his heart. The cockpit canopy creaked open, revealing Vale's face, burned and half-melted, eyes glowing with eternal fury. Before he could react, the canopy slammed shut. Flames erupted, but they did not burn the plane. They burned Kelton. A scorching heat seared his skin, agony blooming beneath his clothes, the pain of fire and ash without a single flame touching him. He fell to his knees, choking on the smell of charred flesh and melting leather. The engine screamed louder, a rising crescendo of wrath and despair. The planes took off, shadows tearing across the night sky, trailing smoke and fire. Kelton watched, helpless, as the ghostly squadron vanished into the storm. But he knew they would return. The haunting was not just a warning, it was a reckoning. The dead were coming back, and they would not rest until their fury was spent, until the living paid for the betrayal that had burned them alive. Dawn never came. The clock claimed it was 7:16, but the skies over RAF Ainsley remained choked in a bruised twilight, clouds swollen like rotting wounds. Rain had begun to fall, thick, greasy drops that left black smears on the windows and clung to the concrete like oil. The world seemed to be decaying in slow motion. David Kelton hadn't slept. He didn't even attempt to. The idea of closing his eyes meant facing the cockpit again, the drowning, the fire, the crash. Each time he dreamt, he died, burned alive in the belly of a war machine. Now, the base had begun to change, not subtly, not metaphorically. The physical world was bending under the weight of something monstrous. The walls sweated. Machinery that had sat dormant for years now groaned to life, even when disconnected. One of the hangars, once a silent tomb for grounded aircraft, now echoed with the metallic screeches of something dragging its limbs along the concrete. It wasn't just Kelton seeing it anymore. Technician Reed was found in the generator room, babbling nonsense, with both of his eardrums ruptured. They said he'd been covering his head and screaming. One ground crew member fled in the night, driving full speed through the base gate, abandoning his uniform, boots, and his mind. Another had hanged himself in the maintenance shed. Above his body, smeared in blood on the ceiling tiles. They sent us to die. Kelton walked the length of the main runway now, alone. His boots echoed with a metallic clink, as though the ground beneath had become hollow, waiting to swallow him whole. The rain hit his face like spit. He smelled something foul on the wind, like kerosene and decay. The sky above pulsed with a dull orange glow, as if the sun had been caught behind a curtain of smoke. And then he saw it again. A single Spitfire, on final approach. He watched, paralyzed, as the ghost plane descended with impossible silence. Its undercarriage was ruined, one wheel missing. The wings were torn, ragged as though clawed by giants. Its propeller spun lazily, its edges dripping something darker than oil. The ghost craft touched down without sound. Its wheels sank slightly into the tarmac, which began to blister beneath it. The air around the plane rippled like heat off an oven. Kelton couldn't move. The canopy lifted. The pilot within was no longer just a vision. He was solid, present. His burned face was taut with purpose, the eye sockets hollow and blackened. But his gaze, whatever it was, locked on Kelton with agonizing intent. The ghost stepped from the cockpit and dropped to the ground. There was no sound as his boots hit the earth, only a faint whisper of fire crackling. Kelton took a step back. The pilot moved toward him with slow, deliberate strides. And as he did, behind him, 6 more Spitfires materialized from the low cloud cover. They floated above the tarmac like vultures in formation, waiting for a signal. The ground cracked under their arrival. Flames licked at the base of the tower. Kelton could hear screams now, not just his own mind unraveling, but voices echoing through the intercom system. Wails of men caught in cockpits as they burned, cries for help never answered. Kelton fell to his knees as the ghost pilot stopped before him. Up close, the figure was worse than the dream. His skin peeled in long black strips. His uniform was melted into his body. A service number was still visible, partially scorched, on his breast pocket. Flight Lieutenant A. Vale. But the eyes, there were none. Only voids. Emptiness that screamed louder than any voice. The pilot leaned forward. From his mouth spilled ash. It drifted toward Kelton's face like smoke with weight. The whisper came again.
We knew we wouldn't return.
Kelton began to sob, trembling, trying to crawl backward, but his limbs were leaden. The ghost reached out and pressed a hand against Kelton's chest. Heat ignited beneath his ribs. A vision burned into his mind. A war room, maps, men in medals, red lines drawn across enemy airspace. A mission marked probable loss. They'll never make it back. Doesn't matter. The attack will draw attention away from the primary fleet, Vale and his squadron. Laughing in the briefing room, unaware, ready to die. Kelton screamed. It was true. The mission had been a sacrifice, a calculated one. Squadron 13 was never meant to return. Their deaths had brought silence, strategy, paper victories, and now their fury had returned. The ghost withdrew his hand. The burning ceased, but Kelton was left hollow, scorched within. The pilot turned and walked toward the tower. The other planes began to land, flames wreathing them like halos of vengeance. Inside the control tower, machinery sparked and burst into flames. Radar screens exploded, sirens screamed into the darkness. As the base was consumed in chaos, Kelton stumbled to his feet. He wasn't sure how long he had. The dead had returned, not for peace, but for reckoning. And he was now their witness, maybe even their voice. The night air was filled with the howl of the damned. RAF Ainsley was no longer a base, but a battlefield between the living and the betrayed dead. The control tower belched fire from its shattered windows, and sirens wailed from nowhere, broadcasting the sound of screaming men who had died decades ago. David Kelton ran through the wreckage, his boots slick with oil and blood. The world around him warped, reality fraying like old fabric. Every corridor echoed with the past, gunfire, shouting, radios bleeding for help, and always, always the roar of engines overhead. The Spitfires circled the sky like vultures, flaming, spectral warbirds whose wings no longer obeyed the laws of physics. They moved with purpose, swooping low over the crumbling buildings, their ghostly pilots locked in some eternal flight pattern of vengeance. The sky was a hellish red, stained with smoke and the glow of phantom fire. Kelton's mind screamed for rest, for reason, but only the truth remained now. Squadron 13 had been sacrificed. He had seen it with his own eyes in Vale's vision. The briefing room where officers, safe behind lines and titles, marked men for death on a map. 7 young pilots eager to fly, sent into a sky filled with gunfire and death. And they had all died, except one. Vale had returned barely, only to crash and die on the runway. And now Vale was back. All of them were back. And they wanted justice. No, revenge. Kelton reached the base chapel, a small, decrepit building left to rot for decades. It stood untouched by the chaos, its crooked cross still leaning atop the sagging roof. Inside, dust and old hymn books, forgotten candles, and a rank smell of mildew. But beneath it was something else. He felt it before he saw it. Below the altar, hidden beneath a loose flagstone, was an old metal hatch. He wrenched it open and descended a rusted iron ladder into the dark. What greeted him was not just decay, but remembrance. Rows of boxes marked with the names of Squadron 13, photos pinned to a board, old journals, mission logs, and on a table, the last flight plan from the day of the doomed mission. Drawn in red ink, the path into enemy territory. Beside it, scrawled in Vale's own hand, long before his final flight, was a note. They know we won't make it. But we go anyway, for Queen, for country. For each other, Kelton clutched the paper, trembling. How had it survived here untouched, hidden? And then he felt it. The heat. Not warmth, not fire. Hate. Behind him, the door creaked open. Shadows poured in. Vale stood at the threshold, his scorched figure towering in the faint candlelight, hollow eyes boring into Kelton's soul. The other pilots appeared behind him, lining the cramped basement like guards at judgment. Kelton stepped forward, holding the mission log with shaking hands. "I know what they did," he said. "I saw it." Vale tilted his head. Kelton's voice broke. I didn't know. I didn't know they sent you to die." The ghost pilot raised a trembling hand and pointed upward, toward the base, toward the officers' quarters.
Burn it.
The voice rasped from Vale's throat. It wasn't speech. It was the sound of flame given language. Kelton looked away. "You want revenge?" Vale's head dipped once. The other pilots leaned closer, their whispers filling the chamber.
Burn the liars! Burn the war room!
Kelton's mind twisted under the weight of their anger. And deep down, something cracked inside him. He emerged from the chapel with the flight log in one hand and a can of fuel in the other. The storm above screamed as the Spitfires spiraled lower, their engines howling with anticipation. Windows burst around the base. Lights died. The living had fled. Only Kelton remained. And the dead. He reached the officers' building, once the administrative heart of RAF Ainsley. Now it stood like a mausoleum, tall and cold. He stepped through the front doors and walked its length, the flight log trailing ashes in his wake. The hallway was littered with old plaques and portraits. The men who had made the decision, brave faces framed in gold, medals gleaming. He poured the fuel across the floor, down the hall, over the portraits, onto the map room. The ghosts stood outside, watching, waiting. Kelton struck a match. The fire caught fast. Flames devoured paper, wood, and lies alike. Smoke bled from the windows, curling into the sky like a signal. Above, the Spitfires roared in approval. Their formation shifted, circling tighter, lower, faster. And then, as if some curse had lifted, the lead Spitfire peeled away. The others followed. Each vanished into the cloud one by one. The air fell silent. The fire burned behind him, but Kelton stood alone. He looked into the dark sky and felt a strange calm settle over him. But then, a new sound, a shriek, not a plane, not a storm, a scream. Behind him, Vale stood again, unmoved by fire or smoke. His eyes were no longer hollow. They were wide, afraid. And something else was there, rising behind the flames, something not born of vengeance, something older, darker. Vale's mouth opened as if to warn, but the fire surged and the ghost pilot vanished in the inferno. And then, silence. True silence. The planes were gone. The voices ceased. The base stood in ruins, but the haunting had ended. For now. Kelton wandered the runway at dawn, and this time, light came. pale and weak, but real. Smoke curled from the burned-out administration block. The chapel remained, silent and watching. Above, the sky was clear. He looked up. Not a sound. No Spitfires. No screams. Only crows. He didn't know if he had banished the spirits or fed them. But he knew one thing for certain. Squadron 13 would not be forgotten again. Thank you for listening to the new series of Whispers in the Dark. If you'd like to support the show, head over to our Patreon, where you can sign up to one of 3 different tiers. Or if you'd prefer to make a one-off contribution, maybe you'd like to buy me a coffee or show support through our website at Buzzsprout. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube to stay up to date with new episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and more chilling tales. Music written and composed by Roman Duchik. I've been the Dark Scald, your storyteller in the darkness. I'll be seeing you soon, and remember, you've heard the whispers. But some doors, once opened, never truly closed. If you feel something watching tonight, don't look back. We'll see you next time, if the dark lets you go.